Thank you very much for joining us for another University of Manitoba, Canada Research Chair Symposium. Hello to you here in the room and also hello to you virtually. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Annemieke Vernorst and I'm the Associate Vice President Research. Let me start by acknowledging that we are on Treaty 1 territory and that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, and Dakota's Peoples territories and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. The University of Manitoba respects the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledges the harms and mistakes of colonialism, past and present. The university is moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So the University of Manitoba has 50 Canada Research Chairs, and they are all funded by the Government of Canada. This month, in April, we submitted 6 nominations seeking Canada Research Chairs renewals or new nominations at the University of Manitoba. And these nominees are leaders in research as it applies to, for example, human security and equity, health and well-being, and food and water security. Yesterday, I was speaking at the Manitoba School Science Symposium Award ceremony, which took place in Max Bell Center at the University of Manitoba. And there were over 100 youth there from grade 4 to 12 that had their science projects on display. What was really interesting to see that how many of these projects were actually connected to the research teams that our Canada Research Chairs are leading. So today we are going to hear from 6 Canada Research Chairs, and we're going to hear about their cutting-edge research. Each will present for about 5 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer round at the end, whereby all presenters will be here on stage. So although we have a time limit for the virtual event, we do have a little bit of a reception in the end for those that are here in the room. So please join us upstairs for some refreshments and further discussions. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. And the first speaker is Dr. Lisa Lix, who is the Tier 1 Chair in Methods of Electronic Health Data Quality. And Dr. Lix is located at the Max Rady College of Medicine. Lisa is also the director of the Data Science Platform at the George and Fayet Center for Healthcare Innovation. Also, Lisa is the senior research scientist at the Manitoba Center for Health Policy. And today, Lisa will discuss challenges and opportunities in the emerging information-rich environments of publication, health, and research, population health and research, rather. Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks, Annemieke. Right, and thanks for the opportunity to join here, and for those of you who have come today. There we go, good. All right, it's a very great pleasure to be here and to be able to talk about my research. So Canada has a wealth of different kinds of electronic health data, including administrative data that are used for monitoring and managing the healthcare system. We also have patient registries and electronic medical records that enable us to do research about the health of populations and the determinants of health. But these data were never intended to be used for research and for surveillance purposes. So my interest as a Canada Research Chair is in exploring the quality of these data for such purposes, including an exploration of how we can estimate the burden of disease in the population for such diseases as osteoporosis, for example, for being able to explore the impacts of prescription medications on the population and potential adverse impacts. and also for predicting risk in the population so that clinicians can counsel patients effectively on possible treatment strategies. My time today, my key messages are the benefits of linking these many different kinds of data together in order to be able to answer diverse kinds of questions about the health of populations. But equally important are that we have arsenals of toolkits that enable us to bring these data together to assess their quality for the many kinds of diverse research questions that we would like to ask, and also to think about new ways that we can use them. For example, exploring unstructured text data that may exist in electronic medical records so that we can better explore patient symptoms and also some of their attributes that may influence their health and healthcare use. I am very fortunate to be able to work with data from the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy. The Population Research Data Repository provides a diverse array of data that include electronic medical records, administrative data, and patient registries that can be brought together to answer many kinds of questions. Not only are there health data in the repository that can be used for these purposes, but also non-health data, social data that includes education, justice, and the use of social services. And these are important for clinicians and other health researchers to better understand the determinants of health. And I've benefited from collaborations that enable us to explore these many kinds of data to answer novel questions. But in order to do that, understanding their quality, their accuracy, and their completeness for these purposes is critically important. As a Canada Research Chair, I benefit from a wide variety of collaborations, and I'll highlight a couple in my closing remarks. Health Data Research Network Canada is funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research to facilitate cross-jurisdictional studies. While Manitoba has a wealth of electronic health data that can be used to study population health and the determinants of health, and while we have universal health care in Canada, that does not mean that we have universal databases. As a consequence, doing research across the provinces and territories is in fact quite difficult. Health Data Research Network Canada was established in order to facilitate our learnings about doing studies using electronic health and non-health data, and to share methodologies, including ways that we can explore the quality of these data to study population health and the determinants of health. The Canadian Network for Observational Drug Effects Studies has been another very exciting collaboration that has been around now for more than 10 years. It uses electronic health data in order to study drug safety and effectiveness, using data from multiple provinces, as well as international data from the US and also from the UK. My role with CNODES has been to explore ways that we can describe data quality, assess the quality of the data for these kinds of drug safety and effectiveness studies, and also report on variation in our results around drug safety and effectiveness studies across jurisdictions. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my strong interest in training the next generation of individuals in order to use electronic health data. One exciting initiative that was funded by CIHR next year is the Artificial Intelligence for Public Health, or AI for PH, national training platform that includes co-investigators from across Canada who are training graduate students, early career researchers, and also individuals within the healthcare system to understand AI tools, how they can be applied, and also equity issues that arise when we apply AI tools in a black box scenario, which happens much too often. That's all. I'd like to acknowledge the Canada Research Chairs Program, CIHR, and also my many trainees who help to explore these topic areas around how to use electronic health data for population health research. Thank you.
Lisa. Our next presenter is Dr. John Adukuba, who is the Tier 2 Chair in Health Economics with Max Rady College of Medicine. John is also the Executive Director of the African Health Economics and Policy Association. John's presentation will focus on the topics of health as well as healthcare and inequities in Africa.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. And it's a pleasure to be here to speak to my research. My research within the Canada Research Chair touches on many things. But more importantly, I would centralize them on the need to achieve universal health coverage in the context of Africa. We know a lot about Africa, how Africa is challenged by inequities and access issues to health services. And that's where my research comes in. You will see that my research that's been proposed within the Canada Research Chair is centered again around SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which kind of came forth from the MDGs. And I will talk to the aspects of SDG where my research addresses. The first and obvious one is poverty. I do a lot of research looking at the impact of poverty on the impact of health care payments on poverty, on how people finance health services and how that can impoverish them, or also looking at what we call the catastrophic impact of financing health services. We don't expect that when people pay for health services, they are unable to buy food, unable to put their kids to school or do basic necessities that they should engage in. These are issues that I have focused on in terms of my research, and that pretty much speak to no poverty issues, and also how households cope with healthcare payments. Many countries, especially in the West, are privileged to have financing of health services covered under whether a universal system or schemes that come through employment. But in Africa, many people are really challenged in terms of having access to health services because they have to pay out of their pocket. Another aspect that my research touches on is, of course, another obvious one, which is good health. Goal number 3 of the SDGs. I'm particularly interested in producing indices to assess universal health coverage. How can we tell whether country A is close to universal coverage or not, or country B is far away from universal health coverage? These are the kind of metrics issues that I'm involved in, wearing my hat as an economist. I'm also interested in looking at health inequalities. Health inequalities are cut across generations, from birth until the grave. So we're looking at including mortality. So we're looking at inequalities, again, that cuts across genders as well. I'll talk about one of the SDGs that touches on gender equality, which of course is the next, which again, universal health coverage comes in there. I wouldn't go in depth into that because I've pretty much touched on it before. But again, the one I want to raise is my interest in adolescent sexual and reproductive health. We've been involved significantly with the WHO in developing some kind of training tools for people within Africa to assess barriers to adolescent and sexual reproductive health. And I'll talk briefly about some of the grants I've got to be able to do this long before I came in. So my research is pretty much like a continuation of who I have been. So I'm not wearing a new hat, but I'm still who I am, continuing my research. And then the other aspect is the one that touches on reducing inequalities in all its forms. Inequalities, like I said, from birth to the grave, and also the social determinants of health, or what epidemiologists might call social epidemiology. So I'm interested in understanding, as part of my chair, understanding what are the key sectors that drive health inequalities beyond the health sector. We know very well access to education is very critical in driving down health inequalities. We also know clearly that access to good food, nutrition affects health outcomes. We also know that the environment, how clean the environment is, has impact on health outcomes. These are issues that I touch on as part of my chair. Lastly, within the SDGs is building strong institutions. I'm really keen to see that countries build strong institutions to address health inequalities, to address access to health services, and also guarantee as much as possible universal health coverage. Not also leaving out the social determinants of health, because with the social determinants of health, you're looking at different social services sectors that all play significant roles in affecting health outcomes. So you cannot deal with health inequalities without taking a look at the different social services that affect health outcomes. So I'm particularly interested in the causes of the causes of the causes, pretty much tracing things back to the origin. You cannot deal with an issue simply by looking at the roof. You also need to look at the foundation as well. And I'm really pleased to have collaborated significantly with many colleagues on the African continent and beyond in many of this research that I have done. And I'm privileged to have received funding from different organizations, including, of course, the Government of Canada as part of the research chair, and also IDRC based here in Canada. IDRC, for example, supports the work I do with adolescent sexual and reproductive health, and many others that you see listed there. And I will just pretty much leave you with the areas that I've talked about and the research outputs that we have been able to, over the years, put together. Of course, this is just a snippet, but we got many others, and I owe this significantly to my collaborators scattered across the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. Very nice slides. Thank you for the presentation. So up next is Dr. Nicole Wilson, who is the Tier 2 Chair in Arctic Environmental Change and Governance. And she is with the Clay Riddle Faculty of Environment, Earth and Resources. And today, Nicole will discuss her research work to promote effective freshwater governance in Canada. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm Nicole Wilson. This is actually my first time on your campus. I spend most of my time at Fort Garry. Maybe I pushed the wrong thing. Oh, there we go. How's that? So I spend most of my time at Fort Garry campus. So I'm happy to be visiting here today. So I'm an Canada Research Chair in Arctic Environmental Change and Governance, and I do a number of things, but I'm going to be sharing with you a bit of my research on freshwater governance in Canada today. So when we're thinking about freshwater governance, what are we talking about? We're thinking about much more than just governments. So water governance is a set of regulatory processes, mechanisms, and institutions through which political actors influence water-related decisions, actions, and outcomes. Water is of the utmost importance for all of life. The presenter who preceded me talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a Sustainable Development Goal 6 on clean water and sanitation. So this is a global goal. In Canada, we're in a very privileged position to have approximately 20% of the fresh water globally. About 7% of that is considered a renewable resource. But one of our challenges is governance. I mean, in many countries, governance is one of the big issues for water. And if we look, you're not in my law or policy class, but if we look at the Constitution Act of 1867, we can see the division of powers between the federal government and provincial governments, which water is not specifically mentioned in the constitutions, but it's divided based on these heads of power. And often the way it's divided is kind of confusing, overlapping, and causes some conflict. And so one of the major issues that's raised related to freshwater governance in Canada is this jurisdictional complexity and overlap, related to this is this colonial nature of water governance in Canada. And in the same kind of Constitution Act, Indigenous peoples' water rights and authorities related to water are not mentioned. And this is something I focus a lot of my research on. So thinking about these governance issues as we respond to emerging and already challenges already affecting us, like climate change being one of the biggest ones that we'll have to face related to water. There's no simple fixes. So in my research program, I'm a community-based researcher. So I do think about the big picture, but what I'm most passionate about is working with communities to look at questions that are of concern to them. So I wanted to share a little bit with you today about my research with Carcross-Tagish First Nation. So I've been working with this First Nation since 2012, so over a decade now. And our research has revolved around the issue of water and water governance. So my PhD research was about modern land claim agreements in Yukon. So they have these modern land claim agreements, which were treaties negotiated after 1973. That's only one piece of the puzzle for them. You see the line bisecting their territory. So they also have unceded territory in British Columbia. So when we're thinking about the jurisdictional complexity related to water and their goal to protect water in their territory, they're navigating two different governance systems in hoping to do this. So again, just to illustrate, one of the primary pieces of legislation in Yukon is the Yukon Waters Act. I won't go into details on that. But again, in BC, we have a separate piece of legislation, the BC Water Sustainability Act. So what we've been working on for the last several years is developing a water strategy that is focused on revitalizing their Indigenous legal orders, centering their Indigenous knowledge systems that really see water as a living entity and a relative, as a way to develop priorities and actions that will protect water in a holistic manner in accordance with their understandings and relationships with water. So that's just a very small snippet of some of the community-based research that I do, but I think when we're thinking about freshwater governance in Canada, one of the key issues is water justice for Indigenous peoples. And so this community-based approach, following Indigenous research protocols and working alongside Indigenous knowledge holders and researchers, such as the two individuals pictured. On the left is Colleen James, and on the right is Coralie Johns. Colleen James is the reason this project is successful. She's a knowledge holder and a community researcher. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and acknowledge the great work they've been doing there, and that I'm grateful to have been a part of it. So yeah, looking forward to hearing more speakers after this. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you for that example. It's very powerful. Now, please, to introduce Dr. Laurie Kirschenbaum, who is the Tier 1 Chair in Molecular Cardiology at the University of Manitoba. And Laurie is also the Director of the Institute of Cardiovascular Sciences at the St. Boniface Hospital Albrechtsen Research Center. Today, Laurie will be presenting about key facts regarding heart disease.
Thank you very much, Annemieke. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming, those in person and those online. I'm hoping from this discussion, maybe we'll be able to develop some collaborations and some opportunity to work together. I guess I will just hit this forward. I really only have the one slide, and I just want to share with you the area of research that we've been engaged in over the past 20 or so years. My candidate research chair is in molecular cardiology. When I first tell people that, they think I study small hearts, but I don't. We try to understand the mechanisms of disease, predominantly why when people have heart attacks, the cells of the heart, which otherwise don't regenerate, die. And so we've been focused on understanding some of the pathways that involve metabolism, mitochondria. I focused on a protein that I identified several years ago as a trigger for mitochondrial injury during myocardial infarction, so heart attack. We've studied many aspects of this protein and how it works. It's regulation at the genetic level, molecular level, and often we talk about developing therapeutics. We've developed several peptide inhibitors to target the protein that we found, at least in preclinical trials, to abrogate or minimize cardiac injury. So that's been a major area for us: autophagy, metabolism, cell death at apoptotic level or necrotic level. and how it impacts human society. One of the other areas that the lab has focused on over the years, and we've identified a huge inequity with respect to how heart disease presents in males and in females. And in particular, this has been a major issue because we've now realized over the past 20 years or so that females and male are much different with respect to heart disease. Females, women even develop different forms of heart disease than men, but consequently are treated like men with respect to cardiac disease. So one of the focuses of the lab is to identify sex-specific differences in males and females and identify how we can abrogate some of the cell death or molecular changes that occur at the genetic or cellular level that can be then targeted for disease prevention. This is very important to me because, I mean, we all have females, women in our lives, my wife, my mom, sisters, etc. And this is something that's globally understudied. The drive for this is developing a woman heart health center at St. Boniface Hospital. That'll be a province-wide program that will focus on research, education, and of course, patient care. And this is something that's currently ongoing, and tremendous support by the university, by the College of Medicine, and of course, St. Boniface Hospital to develop this program. So the program is quite wholesome. It'll involve basic science research, clinical research, and more importantly, focus on the sex-specific differences that can be targeted between males and females to improve quality of life. The other area that I became interested in, really, and it's funny, you know, in terms of science, you never know where it's going to take you. You know, it was perhaps maybe late night TV. I couldn't sleep, maybe thinking of some experiment, and it came to me about hibernation and circadian rhythms. And there's a tremendous amount of literature on the impact of circadian biology on different functions in the body, but particularly heart disease. And that's something I became interested in, and how closely circadian changes, even with the light-dark cycle change, with the 1 hour time change that we had a few weeks back, affects the body, and particularly how shift work, night shift work affects cardiovascular function. So there's about a 30% increase in heart disease, particularly after heart attack or susceptibility to heart attack. And long and the short of it is that shift workers don't do well when you compare them to non-shift worked individuals. And again, the issue is, why does it occur? So through collaborations we've developed locally, nationally, and internationally, this is a focus of ours now in the lab. And again, looking at mechanisms of cell death, sex-specific differences, and how differences in the circadian biology can be potentially targeted therapeutically. Again, why does this affect us? Well, if you look at the diversity in terms of shift workers, predominantly a lot of them are women. And anybody that's had a child will know they're running a shift work if they're up in the middle of the night looking after their baby. So it's a major impact that it has on heart disease. I think globally, the unification of the three programs I've mentioned really tie together a major impact on you know, the population, and hopefully we're able to make a difference. And hopefully maybe through this, we'll be able to develop some collaborations I've mentioned. This is the team. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. These are many of the people I've trained over the years, some of the standing individuals I've had a chance to work with. And of course, the funding agencies, the Canada Research Chair Program, Heart and Stroke Foundation, CHR, of course, that we live off, and very happy to have the support. But more importantly, the University of Manitoba. And I'm very grateful that I was identified a candidate to be a chair, and I wear the, although I'm not wearing the pin, I was going to say I do wear the colors proudly. So I think with that, I'll stop, and we'll make time for the next speaker. And if there's questions that do arise, I'm happy to chat later. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Laurie. And those were some alarming statistics that you just flashed on there. So that's interesting. So up next is Dr. Megan Azad, who is the Tier 2 Chair in Developmental Origins of Chronic Disease at Max Rady College of Medicine. And importantly, Megan was recently awarded with the prestigious Stacey Prize, which is awarded once per year to a scientist who made outstanding scientific research contributions carried out in Canada. Congratulations again, Megan. Macon is also the co-director of the Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center, as well as the deputy director of the International Child Cohort Study. This morning, Macon will share her insights into how breastfeeding shapes the microbiome and lifelong health.
Thank you, Anamika, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some of my team's research on breast milk. So first, I'm going to tell you why we study breast milk, and then I'll tell you about two of the exciting projects we have going on our team. So human milk is, of course, a food. And I think the word superfood is thrown around and overused in sort of our modern era, but I think it truly fits human milk. So if you think about it, this is the only food that has evolved specifically to feed human beings. Everything else that we eat throughout the course of our life is a plant or an animal that evolved for its own purposes. But here we have a food that's designed specifically to feed human babies, and it provides all the nutrients that they require for the first 6 months of life. So if that's not a superfood, I don't know what is. But milk is more than food. It's also a baby's first vaccine. So much so that some countries actually have colostrum, which is the very first milk produced in the first couple of days, listed on the baby's vaccine card. So before any of the 2-3 month vaccines, they have on their colostrum because they know how important it is. And so that's because breast milk contains antibodies from the mother that help the baby fight off infections at a time when its own immune system is still developing. So really important for that immune development as well. And then another maybe buzzword that's overutilized these days is personalized medicine. But again, I think that really fits human milk. So it's personalized in the sense that it's different for every mom and every baby, and it's optimized in a way that is perfect for that baby and to the shared environment that it lives in with its own mother. And then I think some of us who don't spend their daily lives studying breast milk, like the people in my lab, forget that the alternatives to breast milk are actually made from cow's milk. So infant formula is made from cow's milk. If you think of human milk, it's really tailor-made for tiny humans. Here I've got a picture of a baby cow and a baby human. If you've ever seen a calf be born, it's actually up and wobbling around within a couple of minutes or hours. So its milk is optimized for muscle development. If you contrast that to a human baby, that baby is not wobbling around for several months. Instead, it's devoting most of its energy to brain development. And so human milk is therefore optimized for brain development, and the compositions are very different. And then finally, human milk is actually a complex biological system. That's how we like to think of it and study it. So this graphic tells you all the different amazing things in breast milk, and it's got them in different buckets. So there's one bucket for nutrients, there's one for hormones, there's one for nucleotides, and historically, scientists studied human milk in those different buckets. And we've learned a lot that way, but we're sort of at a plateau, and I think to move to the next level of human milk science, we really need to be thinking about all the buckets and everything mushed in together because that's how it's fed to the baby. So that's what we're doing, is to try and understand all the components of milk and how they interact together. So two of our big projects, one is MILK, the Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center. This is co-directed by myself and Natalie Rodriguez, and Nathan Nickel also plays an important part, was a co-founder of MILK. And you can see there that we each bring really different expertise to this center. So I have a background in biochemistry, genetics, and epidemiology. Natalie brings expertise in logistics and operations. She has an MBA, so completely different skill set from me. That's really important for managing these large projects. And then Nathan brings expertise in public health and biostatistics. And we like to study milk and breastfeeding from all of those angles. So the 4 pillars of milk are firstly an infant feeding and lactation database. This is led by Nathan. We had a great introduction to the Center for Health Policy and Administrative Data by Lisa Licks, our first speaker today, and about how there's all these great databases available in Manitoba for research around hospitalizations, physician claims, prescriptions. But what's missing from that database is information about infant feeding. So in other countries, they have routine surveillance of infant feeding practices, but we don't have that in Canada. So we're trying to fill that gap with this database and then link it into those amazing databases so that we can study milk from many angles. And then secondly, we have a biorepository. This is where we collect milk samples from women in Manitoba and elsewhere and analyze them for the many different components. And again, for moms and babies that live in Manitoba, we're able to link that into those amazing administrative databases, which is the 3rd pillar here. So both the milk and the data are linked into that system. And then finally, we have Milk Club, which has really taken off, especially during the pandemic. And this is where we meet once a month with researchers as well as healthcare providers in the community to discuss what is important to research, what is the important research that we've developed, and how can it be delivered back to the people that actually need to know about it. And this has actually gone international. We've had so many people outside Manitoba hear about the club and want to join that we're offering it internationally every few months. And then the last project I'll tell you about is IMIC, the International Milk Composition Consortium. So this is a large project funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where we're looking at human milk from that holistic perspective, studying over 1,000 mother-infant dyads from 4 countries. So that includes Canada, as well as Burkina Faso, Tanzania, and Pakistan. So we're trying to understand the similarities and differences of milk in those contexts. We're studying all the components of milk. So I talked to you earlier about nutrients as well as other components like antibodies. We also study different hormones and cytokines, all of these different components of the milk. And then we work with some pretty amazing data scientists who are experts in machine learning and artificial intelligence to understand how that complex system of milk is linked to infant and child health outcomes. So we're starting with growth, stunting, and wasting early in life. But as the program evolves, I anticipate we'll be looking at other things like gut health and neurodevelopment. So a really exciting project that's still ongoing and has allowed us to develop a whole host of international collaborators. So I want to end off by thanking my team, some of whom are here in the audience, as well as our many collaborators around the world and our many different funding sources. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A period. If we don't get to your question today, then this is where you can reach us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Megan, and go Jets go. So our final presenter this afternoon is Dr. Christine Cowley, and she is the Tier 2 chair entitled Function and Health After Spinal Cord Injury. Christine is also the director of the University of Manitoba Spinal Cord Research Center in the Max Rady College of Medicine. In her presentation, Christine will discuss new insights into spinal cord function and health following spinal cord injury. The floor is yours, Christine.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Can you hear me okay? Good. The microphone is working. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm happy to be speaking here today. And as your last speaker, it's kind of interesting because from my perspective, I will go a little bit granular. I study how the spinal cord functions and what functions the spinal cord performs. Interestingly, it basically provides input to every tissue and organ in the body, so every system is affected by the spinal cord in terms of a regulation of heart control, involvement in the letdown reflex during breastfeeding, and other functions. But basically, what I have been focusing on for a number of years is understanding how we move. And so what are the neural pathways and the neurotransmitters that are used within the spinal cord to produce movement? How do we coordinate movement between left and right, between flexors and extensors? How do we maintain movement when we're exercising, for example? And so as background from a number of years ago, we have been looking at the neurons within the spinal cord and how important are they for movement. And one of the things that we observed is that, although we think about movement classically as something that's, driven from the cortex down, there's a lot of control that happens at the level of the spinal cord that we don't even think about. And so my research background has been in investigating those neurons and what they do and how they're involved in movement. Now, one of the other things that we think about in terms of spinal cord function is how do we keep on moving? So what are the neural pathways and the mechanisms that integrate that movement with activation of those tissues and substrates that are needed to keep you moving? So when you start going on a marathon, how does the activation of that rhythmic movement of walking or running, how does that get coordinated with increased activation of the heart? How does it get coordinated with release of sweat gland tissue so that you can cool yourself when you're moving? So what I study is the neural pathways that are involved in integrating those systems. And then if I look at the long-term training adaptations that occur when people train, or they have increases in activity or decreases in activity, the spinal cord is also responsible for some of those secondary training effects, even though we don't really think about that. So we think about the circadian rhythm and how that's involved in heart disease. Well, there's also circadian rhythms, but there's also neural pathways which end up going through the spinal cord, which are involved with maintaining tissues at a level that's adequate to their level of activity. So after a spinal cord injury, for example, depending on the level of the injury, you may not be able to increase your heart rate. You may not be able to provide sweating when you start to move in response to increases in heat. Secondarily, all people will develop osteoporosis. They'll develop muscle atrophy. Well, what's the role of the spinal cord in mediating those secondary changes that are necessary in order for your body to maintain consistent activity levels when you move? So that's my focus as it relates to spinal cord function. And then my research focus for health after spinal cord injury relates to how do we move and exercise after spinal cord injury, and how can we target the existing spinal neural tissue that's below the level of injury so that people can maximize their ability to move and maximize their ability to activate tissues that are needed for exercise. So how can you get someone who has an injury, say, that shuts off all communication to their heart or to their smooth muscle blood vessels or to sweat glands? How can we tap into that circuitry that's below the level of injury and increase that output? Because increasing that output alone may help in terms of maintaining health. And also it becomes, if we can understand these basic neural mechanisms at how they function normally, that will also have application to wider general population, just generally throughout every population. And then the other aspect of it is, how do we translate research into improved health and life quality after spinal cord injury? So those are my research focuses. And I don't know where I'm at with time, and I can't see my timing speaker. But basically, the things that we've done lately in collaboration with other people in the Department of Physiology, including Jeremy Chopek and Katinka Sachina, is that we have actually found for the first time that there is a link between these neurons that are involved with generating and coordinating locomotor activity, that they actually speak directly to some of these sympathetic autonomic cells that then go out and innervate the target tissues like the heart and the smooth muscle of the vasculature. And so they're actually, in contrast to the way that we used to think about generating exercise responses, that it was a top-down approach, we've actually shown that there's actually a bottom-up approach in terms of neurons that generate locomotion and those that actually speak to neurons that are involved in activating tissues and organs that are important for exercise. And then in terms of health and function after spinal cord injury, one of the things that we've also done is there's a lot of information that's out there that is not translated directly for use by people living with spinal cord injury or within the health systems. So as had been mentioned earlier, there's a lot of inequities in Canada, even though we have an essential healthcare system. Some of those inequities are involved with the provision of essential medical tools or equipment that are needed to survive after spinal cord injury. So for example, we recently surveyed across Canada in each province what is considered essential as it relates to spinal cord injury specific medical devices or mobility equipment. And it turns out that it's completely across the board. And there's means testing, for example, for wheelchairs or for home care services or for neurogenic bladder and bowel supplies in one province versus not in another. And those are all essential for life, yet they're not considered equally in our country. And so even within our system, who decides what the priority is and what should be funded versus what shouldn't be funded has got quite a bit of flexibility across the provinces. And so since I'm at my time, I'll stop and hope we can discuss some of these things after.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. So I'm just going to walk back to the podium now, and I would like to invite all the Canada research chairs to join me and Christine here at the podium. And then we will get ready for questions here in the audience as well as online. So if you are in the audience, please raise your hand if you have a question, and then we will bring you a microphone. And if you are joining us online, please submit your questions to rsvp@umanitoba.ca. And we have Davide, who is standing by here, and he will be able to read your question out loud, and the panelists can answer it. So with that, I'm opening up the floor, whether it's in the room or online. Feel free to ask the question. And I see someone going to the microphone. Yes, first question.
Hi, Alan Becker, pediatrics. A question really across several of the presenters. Appreciate all of those presentations and delighted to see the number of CRC recipients at the university. Question really relates to one of the major inputs to the databases and to our understanding of health and disease. Aside from the multiplicity of electronic medical records, how do you, as individuals in your various areas, see a way toward consolidating in some way those data so that they are easily transported across the various stages? And can you suggest some manner of getting better input of what we're seeing wildly across the public, and that is over-the-counter preparations, be they vitamins or microbiota, prebiotics, etc.? So it's a rather broad question, but it's a frustrating aspect that clinicians, which is where I come from, have to deal with on an everyday basis.
Great, well, I can start with the first question at least, Alan, around bringing together many kinds of data to answer diverse questions, particularly, I think you alluded to across jurisdictions. And we will be stymied by health privacy legislation across the jurisdictions to do that. With Health Data Research Network Canada that I mentioned, there's an emphasis on how we can bring together information in two ways. The first is distributed analysis, which means that we do analyses in our individual provinces and territories, but then use techniques to combine results using meta-analytic methods. That's the most efficient way to bring together a wide variety of data across jurisdictional boundaries, is to do distributed analyses. The second is to rely more heavily on simulated data. There are really advanced simulation techniques that can be used to generate data that are not personal health information, but that mimic it very closely. And I believe that that's another tool that benefits us, bringing together information from diverse kinds of data and across jurisdictional boundaries. Who else would like to answer?
I can comment more as a user of the administrative data. And so while there are many advantages to it, like you mentioned, Alan, there are some frustrating aspects where certain data that are collected at the source of the EMR are not actually making their way into databases. And from my understanding, that can be for several reasons, sometimes because different clinics are using different EMRs. So this is maybe naive, but my dream would be that all the clinics use the same EMR, so then we can have the same data, but I know that's easier said than done. There's, I know from a very specific example, there is information collected about infant feeding. So doctors do ask how babies are being fed, at least some of them do, but there's apparently a section of the EMR that you can opt to turn on, or by default it's turned off. And so it doesn't make its way into the record because it's off by default. So that's something that I'm working on specifically to get turned on in Manitoba, so we can collect those data in a routine way. But I think sometimes it takes a broad, if we could harmonize the EMRs, that would be great. And sometimes it takes a deep dive if you have a particular interest. So it's more of I hear you, I have the same concern, as opposed to a solution.
Yeah, I would comment that's exactly the case. If we were interested in looking at circadian-dependent effects, particularly time-dependent effects, which is well documented, unless I specifically want to chart or find out who's had a heart attack and when, if it's female or male, it's not often readily available. And I think this consolidation is really based upon, the information is there, it's just not consolidated, and we have to go fishing for it. So again, what Megan had said, if it's something that is missing, it's largely because the person wasn't interested who was collecting it at the time, or wasn't viewed as important. So go back and look for it in the database, it might be there. So.
Anyone else?
Sorry. It's okay.
It was a good question.
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. For me, as an economist, working in Africa, where we have very, very weak, not in all cases, but some very weak data architecture. My interest has been looking at how people spend on health services. Okay, I might not be a clinician, but we also do how people spend on health services. Big challenge is the interoperability of data. That means data systems don't speak to each other. And even if they do, it's partial. You cannot get a holistic picture of somebody just by clicking a button. You have to go seeking permission. And that again comes under the whole big umbrella of data governance. So what we try to do is to collect data on how much people spend out of their pocket, which is a very important part of the business. Is we needed to use household survey, but you don't get the entire picture. People don't report. Even if they report, they may underreport for so many reasons. So we needed to triangulate. So we get data from household surveys, and then we have to visit facilities to figure out how much people have paid when they use services, to see whether how much was reported in household surveys kind of corroborate what we collect from facilities. And where there are differences, of course, we apply statistical methods to reconcile and find the best way to kind of get the right, if possible, data. So that's the kind of data that I work with. I don't know whether it really speaks to you, but from my perspective, that's the data we work with. Thanks.
This may not be directly related to the information systems themselves, but it also seems of interest that depending upon the type of information needed is going to be dependent upon the type of issue that the individual may have. So in the case of, say, spinal cord injury, where multiple systems are affected, part of the problem is that there isn't, there's better levels of curated information to treat particular diseases like stroke, for example, where you've got, or trying to have centers across the country, or heart disease is probably one of the best in terms of the way it's treated across the country in the different jurisdictions. If you think about spinal cord injury, even its rehabilitation or its long-term maintenance or maintenance for whatever is required for health is vastly variable across the country because there's no curation as to what should be prioritized. And there's no evidence-based assessment of what that minimum should be. And minimum is not really the right word, especially with individualized medicine. It should be optimizing their health so that there's limiting the amount of secondary consequences that they have or premature death as a result of not having adequate health care at the right time. But it even goes beyond that because the cost of the healthcare system are involved whether or not there's accessible housing outside of the hospital after a person has a particular injury or disease, right? That then speaks to the cost within the healthcare system, but also the information that might be needed at an appropriate time to help people move forward and then not develop secondary injuries or disease or whatever it might be. And for pediatric health, there's probably a wide range of issues that fit within that, but then there's also subgroups depending on what the issues are of the particular person or what their health need is.
Thank you.
I'm not going to speak to this one. It's a little out of my field. Thanks.
So I'm looking at the audience, whether there are other questions in the audience, or Davide, whether we have a question online. I see a question in the audience. Hi, Noel. Good seeing you.
Hi. So my name is Noel Galishik. I'm with the VPRIO. I just had a question that kind of came up with what Megan was saying about a challenge of getting the data, and she wishes that it were all harmonized. So for everyone, what's one of the biggest challenges that you're facing in executing your CRCs, and what you would do to fix that issue or help out with that problem that you're seeing?
I mean, so I'm not in the health field, as you all saw from my talk, so I won't be talking about health data, but some of the things that were mentioned previously are similar issues that we face in terms of interoperability and things like that, and a lot of very data scarce watersheds in the country and things like that. So I see a few things. One being a bigger question about what is data and what knowledge we should be making decisions based on. And so I mentioned this because Indigenous knowledge, we shouldn't be calling it data, but it's a very important source of information. And then also kind of nationally thinking about our kind of water data sets. And actually recently it was announced that there'll be a new Canada Water Agency created, and I see them having a very significant role in terms of ensuring better coverage in terms of data and better accessibility. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but I thought I'd just throw a little water data information in there. So thanks.
Well, in other countries, and I can't remember if it's Australia or New Zealand, where there's more of an evidence-based advisor to government, so that you are making decisions not based on your 4-year political realm, but rather on long-standing information and research, which would also help with this, because if you just have the evidence and then you make a logical decision rather than a political decision, that would obviously help to achieve the goals of what we're all trying to achieve.
One challenge that I see that I addressed in my talk was around training of individuals, particularly in the AI area when it comes, and there's really a need for an interdisciplinary perspective that focuses not just on methods, but on well understanding different types and challenges associated with data. And also from a population health perspective, the issues of equity, certainly. So having people who are able to address all of those is really beneficial for research around using electronic health data for population health research. And this is an area that's changing so rapidly. So specialized training programs, such as the one I mentioned on AI for public health, are really critical.
So many things I could say in response to this question. I'm really glad you asked it. A lot of my research, as you saw, focuses on breast milk. I think a challenge for that field is that it's been severely underfunded. And I know most of us here would say that about our fields, but I think in women's health and in lactation specifically, that's really true. I do feel like we're at a good time and that's starting to shift and change. We were just awarded a grant from the US National Institutes of Health that was from a special call to study human milk. So I'm really encouraged to see those types of initiatives happening. But the other thing you would have seen in my slides is the last one was full of probably 100 different names. So the research I do is in big teams. And that's true from a national and an international perspective. They're complex. We wrapped up one study this year where we had over 150 collaborators. There were over 100 authors on the paper. We had data from 42 countries. Each one of those data sets required a data access and sharing agreement. So there were just a ton of contracts and agreements. And those are not things that I, as a scientist, am trained to deal with. I'm not a lawyer. I don't do high-level budget. So that's why I have Natalie on my team. She brings those skill sets, and I'm really fortunate to have the resources to be able to support a person like that. But at this point, the challenge for us and for our team has been supporting the people, finding and supporting the people that we need to carry out such large and complex projects. And part of that's an infrastructure issue here at the university with the rules that are in place in terms of how we're able to compensate people and how we're able to recruit them. So those are issues I'd be very happy to speak more directly with the VPRIO about, because I think they do hinder our research. And I'd love for my team to be able to just focus on the science and the fun stuff that we're trained to do and have those types of things, which in my mind are headaches, kind of more taken care of. So we have more time for the science. And I think that's not a problem that's unique to the University of Manitoba. It's something that challenges academia in general, because I think the style of research now for cutting edge research, and it's probably true of everyone on this stage, is to work in teams, multidisciplinary, multi-institutional teams. And that's a kind of a new way of doing research. And I think the infrastructure has a ways to go to catch up with it.
Thanks very much. I would tend to agree. The biggest hurdle that we face doing basic science is not so much the knowledge translation. We do that in our publications. We do that at meetings and seminars. It's the application. It's the translational component from the bench to bedside. And we're always talking about that. And so that all the programs that I mentioned that I'm involved with, we've got a very strong clinical team. Which is not, which is very, it sounds very easy to establish, but it's not. The way we do business in Canada, because of our socialized medicine, the docs, have limited research time. The ones that are doing academia, some of them don't have the time that it's really required to spend working with the basic scientists to translate the work into patient care. Also, the collaborations that we see in the US, which is much different compared to our fee-for-service. But the other difference that we see between Canada and the US is the involvement of industry. And the industrial partnerships are very important in terms of taking a drug discovery that we have and then taking it to the next step. So while Smart Park and other areas within the university, DPROI, terrific in terms of putting patents together and trying to find ways to partner with companies, it's still a challenge being able to identify the right partners, industrial partner, and then the clinical partners. So I think to answer your question, we've got all the resources. I'm very satisfied with the resources. Things have been terrific. It's been great to have the additional money coming into the lab and the prestigiousness of the chair, which has helped, I believe, garner additional support. But the question now is how do you apply it? What have you learned and how can you take it forward to the next level? And that component, I don't think has been well developed. And it's not at fault of the university or the institution. It's just something that I think collectively we now have to think about how to translate the work more effectively. You have it?
Sure. Thank you very much. I think that's a very important question. I will talk to two things. One is data quality. I work a lot in Africa, and one of the biggest challenges will be get access to household surveys that are of sufficient quality to be able to do what I want to do. One aspect, if you remember when I talked about the social determinants of health, is understanding the other social services sectors that impact on health, and to be able to figure out to what extent are those other services impacting health. From anecdote, we know clearly that the health sector in itself contributes to health inequalities, not so much, a little, that the bulk of it comes from other sectors. I used to talk a lot about in many forums that if other sectors do well, the health sector will pretty much fly. Just think about it for a moment. If our water is very, very good, high quality, if our roads are good, if there are no insects flying around that disturb us, if our schools are good enough to train people to do the right thing, hygiene, blah, 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 and every other thing is good, you realize that the health sector sits with a very small burden of disease. Then you'll be dealing even so much to do with the non-communicable diseases, and not necessarily within the health sector. People's exercise habit, people's feeding, not to do with the health sector. So how do we get data sets that will be able to tease out some of these other aspects that impact on health inequalities, kind of thing I'm dealing with. Then the other part, which is a challenge, which in economics we call it an exogenous factor. That is something you don't have control over. It's given to you. It's like an act of God or something. In this case, is getting African researchers to Canada is it's a task, big task. It can take you up to a year just to get someone in, and then time you don't get the time to do what you got to do. And that's something I don't know how we can circumnavigate it. It has a lot to do with facilitating visas and facilitating entry of collaborators. It's a big challenge. It's like I said, it's beyond what I can do. Everyone pretty much faces the same challenge if you want to collaborate with researchers from the African continent. So that's for me a very, very, very big challenge. And most of the times I have to find myself on the continent there to be able to work rather than get someone here. And it's a challenge, but you just have to get around it some way. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Wonder if there are any other questions in the room or online, perhaps. I have a question for Nicole. I was reading the other day, I think it was in 2017, that in New Zealand, a river had achieved a person status. And my understanding from talking to people who are from New Zealand, I think they're a bit ahead of us, of Canada. And Christine, you mentioned maybe a different topic, but a similar comment about, well, they're a little bit further ahead in Australia and New Zealand. And just wonder, Nicole, are you looking at other countries in your work, or do you say the context is so differently? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think you're probably talking about the Whanganui River in New Zealand, which is understood to have personhood according to Maori understandings of the world. And so I think, yeah, that model is definitely applicable here in Canada. And I think people are looking at this. But one thing that's really important to, in my kind of learning about Indigenous governance and law, is that these understandings are already there. So when I'm working with Carcross Tagish First Nation, they are already saying water is alive, it's a relative. And so that understanding is already there. So it's not something you would give the water. You would acknowledge that it already is that way. So there are different contexts in which people are talking about this across Canada. I think there's a group looking at Lake Winnipeg. And recently was at the United Nations water meeting in March and saw a presentation by some folks working on the Magpie River, where a municipality and a First Nation have gotten together to acknowledge the personhood of the Magpie River. So this is happening in Canada. And I think it is an important shift, especially to be more in line with Indigenous understandings of water. But also underneath that, we need to look at the kind of legal frameworks and whether or not Indigenous peoples actually, it actually changes something in terms of how decisions are made more sustainably. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you. Any other questions? I do see it's 3:06, so it's probably time to wrap up. So we'll do that. Well, I would like to thank you again, and I have to say you are the most collaborative panelist I've seen so far. Everyone is answering the question, so that was really impressive. So congratulations on that, the award of the best collaborative CRC panelist today. So thank you so much. Big applause for the CRCs. That was very interesting. I do appreciate everyone taking the time, not only to sit in the audience, but also to actually give the presentations. Much appreciated. Thank you online as well for joining us. So this concludes our symposium. I would like to invite you in the room to go up there and have some refreshments and maybe engage with the panelists. And we hope that all of you are joining us again for the next symposium that actually takes place on May 16th at 9 o'clock sharp. And that will be in the multi-purpose room at AMSU at the University Center on the Fort Garry campus. Until then, stay well, and I hope to see you back in May. Thank you very much.